Okay, let's get started. So my name's David Sloan. I'm Chief Accessibility Officer at Vispero, and welcome to today's webinar on digital accessibility in healthcare, preparing for the May HHS compliance deadline. Just a couple of notes of housekeeping before we begin. Captions are available in Zoom for anyone who needs to use captions. The Q&A feature is available to use for asking questions, and I'll take questions at the end for anyone who has questions. We are recording the webinar, and a link to the recording will be available afterwards to everyone who registered, and we'll also send out a copy of the slides. So let's get started. We have a lot to cover on today's webinar. Today, we're going to provide an overview of federal digital accessibility regulations in the US healthcare sector. We'll look at each key of regulation in terms of what it covers, what it requires of covered organizations, and applicable deadlines. And then we'll move to talking about a strategy for addressing digital accessibility obligations that covered healthcare providers can adopt, regardless of size or available resources. And then we'll include some additional guidance for vendors to the healthcare sector, organizations that might not directly be subject to regulations, but nevertheless may find a business benefit in meeting in supporting their customers in the regulated healthcare sector. Before we continue, a couple of notes as a disclaimer. Firstly, I'm not a lawyer, and this webinar does not offer legal advice. So if anyone attending needs specific guidance on how applicable laws affect their organization and activities, please seek legal advice. It's also worth noting that recent events over the last year or so have created some level of uncertainty over the direction of disability rights legislation and regulations in the United States. And in particular, when we consider the legislation we're going to be talking about today, there are some current legal challenges to aspects of those laws. The Department of Justice has also been active in filings that may affect the applicability of Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we'll talk about. But just to emphasize, this webinar focuses on the digital accessibility obligations of regulations as they currently stand, and I won't make any predictions about what may or may not happen in the future. And regardless of the current or future state of regulatory requirements, people with disabilities need accessible and usable digital healthcare resources. There is a compelling motivation to invest in accessible and usable digital resources to help provide better healthcare to more people. So let's start by exploring current healthcare regulations in the United States and their relationship to digital accessibility. And we're going to look at some key pieces of key regulations. Firstly, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, then Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, and thirdly, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. We will also, I will make mention that there may also be state laws depending on where a healthcare provider operates. That's out of scope for this webinar. So firstly, let's look at Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Now, the Rehabilitation Act was passed back in 1973, which significantly predates other disability rights law and also predates the influence of digital technologies such as the web, long before the web existed as we know it now, as a means to provide healthcare programs. But essentially, Section 504 prohibits discrimination based on disability in federally funded programs and activities. And quoting from the legislation, it protects anyone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or has a record of such impairment, which means someone may have had an impairment in the past, or is regarded as having some impairment. And that third part really kind of extends coverage to people who may be perceived as having a disability, so that it protects people discriminated against by having, by people who perceive them as having a disability. Section 504 defines the rights of people with disabilities to participate in and have access to program benefits and services. And while Section 504 applies to all federal agencies, which each have responsibility for enforcing Section 504, Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, enforces Section 504 for federally funded healthcare programs or programs that receive federal funding. And in 2024, so remember, this legislation was introduced in 1973. In 2024, 2 years ago, HHS updated the Section 504 regulations to provide more clarity on non-discrimination and including more information or more guidance, more requirements on the applicability of Section 504 to healthcare services provided using what is referred to as information and communication technology, ICT, a broad-reaching term that covers multiple different technologies that we'll explore shortly in the webinar. So we'll come back to learning more about what that update covers and requires of covered organizations. But first, let's turn our attention to the Affordable Care Act, and particularly Section 1557, which was first added to the Affordable Care Act in 2016 and has undergone some revisions since then. And Section 1557 prohibits discrimination on multiple factors, the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, age, or disability in certain healthcare programs and activities that receive federal funding assistance. HHS amended Section 1557 in 2024 to provide some additional clarification on the rule as was, including some aspects of accessibility that are of particular relevance to this webinar and to digital accessibility efforts. These include more clarity on effective communication for people with disabilities in health programs and activities, including the need to provide auxiliary aids and services where necessary. This is covered in Section 92.202 of the regulations. And effective communication is something that's also present in other disability rights legislation, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act that we'll cover in a moment. And then another piece of Section 1557 of particular relevance to digital accessibility is an addition of a section on accessibility of information and communication technology, ICT, for people with disabilities. So that's covered in Section 92.204. Just for sake of completeness, there are a couple of additional technology-focused areas in Section 1557 that we won't go into further detail today, but these include obligations to avoid discrimination in the use of tools to support clinical decision-making, which includes a specific responsibility to identify and mitigate risk. And this addresses things like tools that use algorithms to propose or make healthcare decisions, including the use of AI, where there's a potential risk of bias against people on account of a disability. And then another area of Section 1557 is to avoid discrimination in delivery of telehealth services. So they're using ICT to provide remote healthcare support. A lot of those, the means of providing that remote healthcare are covered in some of the aspects of Section 1557 and Section 504 that we'll cover shortly. But there's a clear call out for requirements to ensure that telehealth services are accessible to people with disabilities. So then the third piece of legislation of particular relevance to today's conversation is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which was enacted in 1990 to provide broad protections for individuals with disabilities against discrimination on account of a disability. And the ADA covers multiple sections, in particular employment, protection of people with disabilities in employment, covered under Title I of the ADA, access to state and local government programs, services, and activities, Title II, which includes state and local government funded healthcare programs, places of public accommodation, Title III, and I apologize, there's a mistake in the slide there. That should say Title III, and that affects private entities providing places of public accommodation, and then telecommunications covered in Title IV. Until 2024, there was fairly limited clarity in how the ADA applies to information and communication technology. Again, when the law was introduced in 1990, the web, as we knew it, was in its infancy, and the influence of the web and other digital technologies and providing access to all sorts of things in society was very limited. And even over the subsequent years, ADA technical standards were limited in terms of digital technology to ATMs and fare machines. We also had some case law and settlement agreements that included some reference to digital accessibility requirements, and occasional communications from the Department of Justice sort of saying, yes, the ADA applies to the digital world, but these were informative communications rather than amendments to the law. But then in 2024, the Department of Justice published amended regulations extending Title II to include digital accessibility requirements. And this is of particular interest to the healthcare sector because there's a kind of cascading connection between these key pieces of regulations, ADA Title II, Section 504, and Section 1557. Firstly, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act references Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act for technical accessibility requirements. So there are no technical accessibility requirements in Section 1557. It's pretty broad and general in terms of obligations. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act directly references the Title II digital accessibility requirements. So ultimately, it's ADA Title II that sets the digital accessibility requirements that cascade into Section 504 and Section 1557. And this is good news because this harmonizes what it means to be accessible across these different pieces of legislation, rather than having distinct and different accessibility requirements. It makes it easier for people to understand what is needed by referencing one specific set of accessibility requirements. So the next few slides, I'll kind of focus on the Title II rule, even though it effectively applies to Section 504 and by extension to Section 1557. What technologies are covered by the ADA Title II rule? Well, it's very specific to web content and mobile apps. And by web content, that means HTML web pages, including embedded audio and video. So any video or audio that's present in a web page is covered, and also digital documents available via the web. And the Title II rule specifically refers to digital documents as conventional electronic documents. So it's talking about things like Microsoft Word, Microsoft PowerPoint, spreadsheet files, PDF files made available through the web. They are all covered by the Title II rule. And the Title II rule has a very specific technical accessibility requirement, which is that covered web content and mobile apps must meet Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.1 to level AA standard. And it's worth noting that this should be considered a baseline level of conformance. And there's nothing in the rule that would stop an organization deciding to meet a higher level of accessibility, such as WCAG 2.2 level AA, or going to include some level AAA success criteria of WCAG. When the Title II rule was passed, WCAG 2.2 had been published, but it was new enough that the Department of Justice felt that it was unreasonable to expect covered organizations to adopt 2.2, so they went for the version previous, but that does mean that when the rule was passed, it referenced one version older than the current version of WCAG. One thing that the Department of Justice was unable to do was issue a rule that refers to the latest version of a standard, quote. They had to reference a version by name rather than reference something that in the future could reference a version that did not exist at the time of the rules passing. They had to be clear in specifying a version. And also, when you read the discussion around the evolution or the implementation of the Section 504 rule, the Department of Justice decided they didn't want to adopt the Section 508 standards, which are also part of the Rehabilitation Act, because they refer to an older version of WCAG. So Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act includes the ICT standards, which adopt WCAG version 2.0, which is an older version. And the Department of Justice decided that they didn't want to create that harmony between Section 508 and Section 504 because of this difference in version of WCAG. So there is a disconnect there, which causes a slight issue when we think about kiosks, another closed functionality technology used in healthcare environments. The Section 504 rule, the updated rule, explicitly includes mention of kiosks, unlike the ADA Title II amendment. However, Section 508 doesn't set technical requirements for accessible kiosks. Instead, and I'll quote from Section 84.83, the particular part of Section 504 that references kiosks, the requirement is that no qualified individual with a disability shall, on the basis of disability, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or otherwise be subjected to any program or activity of a recipient provided through kiosks. Now, that still leaves a bit of interpretation. And the intention at the time was that there would be a separate ADA rule clarifying kiosk accessibility requirements, but that hasn't happened yet, and we don't anticipate that happening in the near future. But kiosks should still be provided with accessibility for people with disabilities. And the 2010 ADA standards, Section 508, and the European standard EN 301549 all provide helpful requirements for accessibility of kiosk hardware and software. So it's certainly worth paying attention to those requirements. So Section 504 has specific deadlines for compliance with the rule. And interestingly, or potentially confusingly, they are like the ADA Title II. The deadlines are different based on the size of the covered organization, but the qualifying characteristics and the dates are different to Title II. So with Section 504, the deadlines for compliance are May 11th, 2026 for covered organizations with 15 or more employees, and May 10th, 2027 for organizations with fewer than 15 employees. So it's important to note that these are distinct to the Title II compliance dates. They're slightly later, just by a matter of a couple of weeks, and the organization size is significantly different given the applicability of Section 504. Now, these are effective compliance dates. We might not see federal enforcement the day after those dates, but healthcare providers should definitely be ready to match compliance inquiries or complaint letters and be anticipatory in meeting those requirements. By contrast, Section 1556 compliance date has already passed for most of the requirements. It was July 5th, 2024. But because Section 1557's requirements are very general, the sort of specific accessibility requirements there are harder to measure, and kind of focusing on the Section 504 deadlines for specific technical conformance makes most sense. So there are some exceptions on the Title II rule and hence the Section 504 rules applicability. And these exist to help covered organizations prioritize their efforts on achieving technical accessibility conformance on areas of highest positive impact to people with disabilities. This is really recognizing that covered organizations may have lots of resources to address and relatively limited limited capability to address those all at the same time. So prioritizing efforts is a critical part of any conformance strategies we'll come back to shortly, and the exceptions help with this process. It's important to note that the exceptions are specific to covered ICTs and not to the parent regulation. So the effective communication and reasonable accommodations requirements still apply, even if a specific digital resource may fall under one of the exceptions for the technical accessibility requirements. And the exceptions have been put in place to apply to certain types of digital content based on its age, its format, its purpose, and who produced it. And the rule has some very specific definitions of what is included in an exception. So if a piece of digital content or digital resource doesn't meet that definition, then the exception doesn't apply. It's important to really be very familiar with those definitions of exceptions before claiming that a digital resource is exempted from requirements. So the types of exceptions are as follows. Archived web content, pre-existing conventional electronic documents, content posted by a third party, not formally engaged by a public entity to provide content, individualized password protected content, and pre-existing social media content posted by a covered organization. Now, looking at each of those in turn, archived web content has a very specific definition, including that it must be content that was created before the date that the healthcare provider must comply with the rule, or it reproduces paper documents or content of other physical media that were created before the compliance deadline, and that the content's retained only for reference or research or record keeping, and it's kept in a special area identified as being archived content, and it hasn't been changed since it was archived. As soon as content's changed, it's no longer archived. It's live and active and part of delivery of programs and services. So again, very specific definition of what archived content means. Pre-existing conventional electronic documents has a similar definition in that it must be content that was available before the provider had to comply with the rule, and that they're not currently being used to provide healthcare services, programs, or activities, and that they are either word processing files, presentation, or spreadsheet files, or PDFs. So again, there's a specific definition of conventional electronic documents. Content posted by a third party that's not formally engaged by a public entity to provide content would be anything that's like a comment on a blog post or something that was unsolicited but forms part of web content that wasn't specifically requested by the healthcare provider. Individualized password protected content is one where there's definitely some level of concern about its applicability in the healthcare context, given that individualized password protected documents are significant and common digital assets used in the delivery of healthcare services when we think about electronic health records, visit notes, prescriptions, test results, documents of that nature. So it's really important that people with disabilities can still access that information and in an accessible form, even if it's considered an exception under the specific digital accessibility rules. So don't assume that you don't have to do anything about accessibility. And indeed, it's a good idea still to focus on making sure that content is accessible to everyone, regardless of disability. And the final exception, pre-existing social media content, is really kind of self-explanatory. Anything posted on a social media platform before the deadline, it's a way of saying, don't, if you have limited resources, don't spend all of that effort on fixing Facebook posts from a long time ago. There are some other potential exceptions of importance. Firstly, when trying to meet the technical accessibility requirements for a covered resource would cause either undue burden, which would be financial or administrative, and or it would require fundamental alteration. So paraphrasing, if it would cost too much or if it would change the resource too much, then you may be able to claim an exception under the undue burden or fundamental alteration exceptions. Now, these are pretty consistent across the ADA, Section 504, and the ACA, and they require a defined process that involves legal advice and with an organization's financial leader. They're processes that shouldn't be entered into lightly. There's a pretty clear process that must be followed to claim undue burden or fundamental alterations. So, think carefully before deciding that to try and use one of those exceptions as a reason not to fix a digital resource to bring it into conformance with the technical requirements. Other potential exception situations include when not meeting the technical requirements would not materially affect access to content, functionality, or participation for people with disabilities. In other words, it may be technically non-conformant, but there's no real-world impact on people with disabilities. And we'll come back to that in a moment because that has an interesting implication. And the other exception, which is pretty rare and something again that's really only to be considered in extreme situations, when not meeting requirements for a particular digital resource could be mitigated by providing a conforming alternative version instead of one version that meets those WCAG 2.1 AA requirements. Generally, don't recommend organizations look to providing a separate resource to meet accessibility requirements. Trying to maintain two resources is usually a greater administrative overhead, and the risk of the accessible alternative falling out of conformance or not providing the same service or providing access to the same information is often quite high. So it's much better to try and focus on providing one resource that meets accessibility requirements. Going back to that other exception, the really sort of helps kind of pivot attention ultimately to making sure that digital resources provide equal access to programs, services, and activities for people with disabilities. If you can verify that a technical non-conformance instance has no impact on people with disabilities, then you effectively meet the requirements of the rule. So that encourages a focus on user experience. How would you verify that a technical conformance issue has no impact on users? The best way to do that is by testing with users. So if you can show that people with disabilities can use a digital resource to receive healthcare services and programs without difficulty, then you're effectively meeting what is required and ultimately, most importantly, supporting users, supporting patients. So that means that whatever you do, and as we pivot into a strategy, we'll talk about this more, but whatever you do, including people with disabilities and seeking feedback from people with disabilities, should always be a priority. Firstly, in evaluating existing digital resources for potential issues, and in the design, development, and testing of new digital resources that are built after the compliance requirements come into force. So let's now pivot into talking about digital accessibility strategy for healthcare providers. And we'll look at this at two sort of parallel efforts. Firstly, to address the current state, and secondly, to plan for a future where accessibility is an integral part of a digital strategy. Now, when we plan for accessibility, it's helpful to look back at the ADA Title II regulations, and these are historical regulations rather than the ones just introduced, because it provides a really valuable approach to meeting compliance requirements for covered organizations and improving accessibility in a way that's sustained over time. And this is an approach that can be followed more widely, including by healthcare providers subject to the Section 504 and ACA requirements. And this approach is two-pronged. Firstly, to conduct a self-evaluation of programs, activities, and services to identify barriers to access by people with disabilities. This is the kind of current state. Where do we lie right now in terms of possible issues that people with disabilities might encounter? And then secondly, is to create and implement an action plan that identifies firstly how the barriers discovered in the self-evaluation will be addressed, by whom and when. And secondly, how to build organizational capacity to ensure that digital accessibility is effectively managed over time in a sustainable. And this is a broad approach that can be adapted by organizations based on their available resources, budget, and time, and encourages organizations to take advantage of existing expertise, processes, procedures, policies that cover broader disability inclusion to establish a shared understanding of what the digital accessibility requirements are and how best to respond to meet them and maintain meeting obligations over time. It's really not enough just to try and fix things, but it's essential to maintain that commitment to sustaining accessibility over time. So let's talk more about a focus on addressing or assessing and addressing current state. And there are a number of phases to this approach, and taking a methodical approach and making sure that this approach is documented helps you as an organization be strategic in assessing and addressing current state and letting others know that you're taking that strategic approach. Firstly, inventory your existing digital resources. Your goal of this effort is to find out which of those digital resources are subject to applicable regulations. So documenting all your digital resources as far as possible and understanding which ones are covered by legislation, and then prioritize those resources for attention based on factors such as the purpose of the resource, what role does it play in providing healthcare programs and services, the frequency and criticality of use of the resource. Maybe it's something that people use a lot, or it's only used occasionally, but when it is, it's used in an emergency situation, maybe like any resource supporting emergency access to healthcare. Other factors to consider in prioritization are the planned lifetime of the resource. If the resource is due to be retired or redesigned, then it may not be so such a high priority to fix for accessibility in the meantime if it's going to be replaced or updated anyway. And then ownership, who has access to the resource, who would be responsible for fixing issues if they were found? Is it your organization or is it a vendor? It may be that in certain cases, ownership influence the prioritization of attention for the resource. Once you've have this prioritized inventory of what you currently have and what's subject to regulations, then you need to evaluate those existing resources with the goal of finding out where accessibility issues are that affect access to programs, services, and activities. And take that priority order to decide what to evaluate first. Use a mix of methods to perform an accessibility evaluation, which can include automated testing against the WCAG 2.1 level AA requirements, manual accessibility testing, disability testing with people with disabilities, and also, where possible, finding research or researching where people may already have reported issues with your digital resources. So there may be customer support or help desk information where people have logged issues. Maybe publicly people are talking about issues they're having with a website or an app or some digital source. For kiosks and hardware, consider evaluating against additional relevant standards such as the Section 508 ICT standards and European standard EN 301549. Once you have evaluated a resource, then the next phase is to remediate that, to fix the issues identified in the evaluation as best you can. So for each resource that's been evaluated, you can also take a prioritized approach to remediating those issues, considering factors such as the severity of an issue on people who are affected and their ability to complete tasks and achieve goals. Remember, going back to the rule, if an issue, a technical compliance issue exists, but it has no impact on affected groups' ability to complete tasks and achieve goals, then it may not need to be addressed, but you need to be sure that that is the case, and that that it isn't affecting users. Another thing to consider in terms of prioritization and what to fix first. What's the level of effort to fix the resource or fix the issue? If an issue has a high severity and a low effort to fix, then that's something you do first. It's something that you can quickly address, and it's going to have a very positive impact on users. Then clearly that's something you'd want to prioritize in your remediation efforts. You may also want to consider availability of workarounds. If an issue is present and there's no other way for somebody to access functionality and complete tasks, then that would again be a high priority. Whereas if there's multiple to achieve the same goal, then it may be a low priority. Once you've implemented remediation efforts, then it's important to validate those efforts through further testing. Again, you want to make sure that your remediation efforts were effective and that they really did remove those issues and that they allow people to be able to use the resource for its intended purpose. And as you go, document your efforts to implement remediation. Your goal there is to provide evidence of those efforts and provide support for people affected while remediation is still underway. And things to document might include your methodology, your prioritization strategy. What approach did you take to deciding what to test first and then what to fix first, so that that's clearly documented and available to anybody who needs to see it. Progress in remediation for a given resource. How far are you along the journey of fixing the issues that were identified in the evaluation? For a given resource, what level of support can you offer, and how do people access that support who are affected by barriers or issues identified while they're still in existence? And then, where necessary, what is your justification for not remediating issues identified? And this is where those exemptions that I mentioned earlier may come into play. Documenting the process for deciding that an exception applies is important, again, so that anybody who needs to know to have access to that evidence can do so easily. So that's the focus on assessing and addressing current state, and again, emphasizing prioritization. You can't do everything at once, so make a very deliberate effort and document those efforts to implement evaluation and remediation in a prioritized fashion. But what's also important to focus on is to build organizational capacity. And it's really important to try and do this as much as possible in parallel with addressing the current state, so that you are ready to ensure that any new resource that you provide or procure is born accessible to the greatest possible extent. And there are a number of different phases to building accessibility capacity in an organization. Firstly, it's important to establish shared ownership across the organization and hierarchically. Make sure that secure leadership support so that accessibility is considered an organizational priority, is recognized as something that is a priority and an obligation, and has top-level support rather than just being a grassroots effort where people want to do the right thing but have no authority to make things happen. Then it's important to define accessibility, accountability, and responsibility for every role in the organization that's involved in creating, managing, procuring, or maintaining digital resources. So this is really all aimed at making sure that everyone in the organization knows how accessibility expectations fit into their job duties. It's a way of understanding that accessibility is a shared responsibility. It's not the responsibility only of an accessibility subject matter expert or an ADA coordinator or someone else who kind of champions accessibility, but it is a shared responsibility. But there is leadership support and ultimate accountability, from an executive level. Ensuring shared understanding is important to an organizational accessibility strategy, and it helps everyone talk about accessibility using a common language. You ask people what's meant by accessibility, and you make it different definitions. So having a shared understanding is really important to align toward a common goal. An organizational accessibility policy is a great way to communicate accessibility as a core value and how the organization is going to commit to that value and help all employees honor that value. An organizational accessibility standard communicates more specifically what's meant by accessible. And in this context, having a minimum technical accessibility standard of WCAG 2.1 level AA helps ensure that the organization is aligned with those regulatory minimum obligations. Having a governance framework in place communicates how digital accessibility efforts will be monitored, how course correction can happen based on progress, and what are the consequences of digital resources that don't meet the accessibility policy and standard. And including accessibility requirements in any new digital resource specifications help ensure that accessibility is communicated as a priority right from the start, and making sure that accessibility goals drive digital innovation and transformation rather than something that's reactive once decisions are made to implement a new technology or course correct. Accessibility should be a driver for innovation and be recognized as something that's a core requirement right from the start rather than something that's added in once other decisions are made that might get harder to meet accessibility goals while building or procuring a resource is underway. Another phase of building organizational capacity is to build knowledge and skills. And it's really important to provide role-based training on accessibility to help employees understand how they can meet their particular accessibility responsibilities and also support the organization's overall accessibility goals. It helps them understand their role. It helps them make sure that they're not exposed to accessibility information that isn't relevant to them. It can be a challenge when you give general accessibility training to everyone and it feels overwhelming. You're getting all sorts of information, some of which may not be relevant or may imply that you have to be a developer in order to be an accessibility or include accessibility when you're writing digital content. So role-based training helps people understand where their connection with accessibility is and where it stops, where to go for specialist help, who else is responsible for other parts, so that people understand where they fit in the jigsaw puzzle. Providing resources, tools, and services to help staff meet their accessibility responsibilities is important, whether it's creating accessible content, even pointing people to the embedded tools in Microsoft Office applications so that people can check Word documents or PowerPoint for accessibility issues and fix them before they're published, or PDF accessibility checking tools, whether there are tools built into web content management systems. Making people aware of those tools and encouraging their use will help and reduce the chance that content is published with accessibility barriers that then need to be fixed later on down the line. And related to that, general processes and procedures for testing digital content of different types for accessibility, how to make best use of automation in testing apps and web content for accessibility can help it improve efficiency and reduce the manual overhead of accessibility checking. And ultimately, when and how to engage with accessibility specialists, whether they are in-house staff or third-party consultants that the organization works with, and how and when to engage with people with disabilities in accessibility efforts, and again help people understand where they can go to provide or to receive help in their effort. Growing workplace capacity is a great way to help accessibility become embedded in culture and practice and in a sustainable way. And different ways of achieving that include hiring people with lived experience of disability as employees. They help bring insight into accessibility and accessible user experience and can build connections, provide first-hand perspectives on the effectiveness of accessibility efforts. Job descriptions that include accessibility expectations help communicate that those expectations to staff and support hiring of new employees who have those accessibility skills rather than having to train them once you've hired them. And professional development and performance assessment frameworks are great tools to reward accessibility excellence. Rewarding, recognizing, highlighting, and sharing best practices in accessibility is always motivational and helps with consistency of efforts across the organization and helps reduce the sense that accessibility is an impossible goal and that success is never achievable. Sharing those best practices, sharing achievements can be really motivational. Something particularly critical to the healthcare sector is managing accessibility and third-party supplier relationships. Vendors are critical partners in a digital strategy for a healthcare provider. They're also critical partners in meeting regulatory requirements. So vendors who provide accessible products will stand out in the market. So it's really important to communicate with your vendors, ask them what they're doing to provide accessible technology. And if they can't answer that question, then look at alternatives where available. As healthcare providers, you'll be in the same boat as others. So the pressure on vendors to raise their game from an accessibility perspective is only going to increase. Implement an accessibility policy that focuses on managing accessibility risk throughout the supplier relationship with a vendor of ICT products, including ensuring accessibility expectations are present in requests for proposals and other specifications for things that you're looking to buy, including accessibility when assessing candidate solutions and vendor capability, understanding and managing any accessibility risk of a product or service that you decide to procure, recognizing that in reality, the product that you choose may not be the best performing one in accessibility, or there may not be any product that is a high performing one in accessibility. You still have to deal with the accessibility risk, assuming you go ahead with the purchase of the product. And then defining accessibility responsibility in contracts, what are the vendor's obligations to meet accessibility requirements of things that may be discovered after the contract has been signed. What controls are in place to ensure that the vendors meet those responsibilities over time. And then it's really important to communicate your accessibility progress and plans for maintaining and improving accessibility over time. Providing communication channels where issues or concerns can be reported and acted upon helps ensure that you identify those barriers as early as possible and address them as fully as possible. So that might include an accessibility statement on a public website, dedicated channels to report issues, like an email address, a web form, ensuring if there's a phone-based customer support or help desk service that they're aware of digital accessibility and can provide the necessary guidance. Making sure that in addition to collecting the information through dedicated channels, there's a process in place to address the feedback received, including escalating to the responsible staff and also responding to the person who's provided the feedback letting them know what you're doing about it, keeping them updated on progress, and providing whatever help they need while those issues are remained. And as a general ongoing organizational effort to make sure that you are reporting on accessibility efforts internally as well as externally, showing progress and identifying where ongoing efforts are still needed, maybe where adjustments to strategy are needed, so that you're constantly monitoring performance and making necessary adjustments to ensure progress. And while we talked about vendor management from the healthcare provider perspective, I want to finish just with a couple of additional notes for vendors to healthcare providers. While a vendor who's in the private sector may not be directly subject to the regulations that we've talked about today, there's clearly huge motivation for vendors of ICTs to provide accessible ICTs to customers in the healthcare sector. So the motivations may be slightly different, even if the strategy that I outlined earlier is essentially the same. Consider the risk of losing business by failing to meet healthcare providers' accessibility obligations, by failing to understand their accessibility needs. The revenue opportunities to gain new customers by having accessibility as a quality of the products that you offer, and the reputation, the opportunity to build trust with your customers and partners in the public healthcare sector, reassuring them that you have their backs, that you understand their accessibility needs, and you're taking steps to ensure that those are met. And in addition to doing the work to provide digital services and products that meet those accessibility requirements, you should be focusing as a vendor on documenting evidence of your capability and your capacity to deliver accessible products and services that help your customers in the healthcare sector meet obligations. That might include an accessibility conformance report of a product using the VPAT, the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template format, or evidence of successful use by people with disabilities, information that shows that your products are usable by people with disabilities. And where you've still got work to do, sharing accessibility roadmaps, identifying your plan for improving accessibility, and your broader investment in accessibility efforts. Maybe it's the people you're hiring, the accessibility knowledge and expertise that you have to help move your accessibility efforts forward. So just to conclude, the few key takeaways from today's webinar: digital accessibility's requirements affect websites, documents, mobile apps, and kiosks, and other ICTs that are used to provide healthcare services. And when you focus on digital accessibility efforts, they help you provide better healthcare services to more people who need them. Digital accessibility ultimately is a user experience improvement and will help improve the efficiency and effectiveness of healthcare delivery through accessible digital resources. So it's important to act now by establishing and implementing a plan, firstly, to evaluate and address currently covered digital resources, and secondly, to build organizational accessibility capacity so that you can maintain conformance and build new digital experiences that provide an accessible user experience and maintain that over time. So I'm just going to finish with a slide that provides links to several helpful resources. We'll share the slide deck afterwards so that you'll have access to each of these resources rather than me reading out the URLs right now. But there are lots of useful official documentations and supporting resources, including for the ADA Title II rule that's referenced by Section 504. So with that, I'm going to finish up. I am going to check for questions, and it looks like there's one in the mentions. May 10 and May 11th. So it's May 10. I am just going to flip back to the slide in question so that I don't misquote myself. A question about the compliance dates for the Section 504 requirements. Here we go. So yeah, May 11th, 2026 for larger organizations and May 10th, 2027 for smaller organizations. So similar to the ADA Title II, larger organizations have a compliance deadline of this year, and smaller organizations have an extra year to meet those requirements. So that was the only question I had from the Q&A. Thank you all for attending today. Like I say, we'll send out the slide deck and the recording after the question. Oh, I see another, possibly some more questions. Thank you for the feedback. I agree with Peter Thorsett's comment that a rather complicated subject. Hopefully, I've helped clarify things. Again, I must make clear I'm not a lawyer. I'm a digital accessibility advocate and consultant who's trying to disentangle the related requirements, but essentially WCAG 2.1 level AA is a minimum requirement, and focus on digital programs and services that people with disabilities can use. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Good luck with your accessibility efforts, and if we can help further with those efforts, then please do get in touch. Thank you, everyone.